Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades, friends. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 53. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. I welcome the new people that have just joined on to support African History Club. For anybody that wants to support us, of course, you can go to African History Club on Patreon. So today I would like to discuss the trial in absentia and conviction on April the 6th of Blaise Compaore, 35 years after the brutal murder of Thomas Sankara, the Pan-African revolutionary late president of Burkina Faso. Blaise Compaore, his supposed comrade, was convicted of complicity in Sankara's murder in October 1987, and he was handed a life sentence imprisonment. Of course, it's questionable whether he will serve time. I think it's up to us global Pan-Africanists, to put pressure to make sure that he's eventually extradited. He now lives in neighboring Ivory Coast, which has given him asylum since he fled in 2014 when he himself was overthrown in a popular uprising in Burkina Faso. He was helped in terms of fleeing the country by France, which is the neo-colonial power in much of West Africa. So in this trial in absentia, there were 13 other co-defendants and 2 senior former officers in the military were also handed life sentences. About 8 former soldiers got sentences ranging from 3 years to 20 years in prison. 3 individuals who were accused of concocting a fake death certificate which had listed cause of death for Thomas Sankara as natural causes, those individuals were acquitted. I guess compared to the severity of the other crimes in which convictions were handed down, those were seen as minor offenses. It's up to us really to put pressure on Ivory Coast. And I myself have already launched a campaign on change.org calling on Ivory Coast to extradite Blaise Compaore to Burkina Faso so he can face justice that he deserves for ending the life of Thomas Sankara, who had changed the course of the country's history and was beginning to change the course of African history at the time of his brutal assassination, shot multiple times together with 12 other colleagues, and then ultimately all were buried in a mass grave. Many of them had their bodies mutilated after they were killed. So who was Thomas Sankara? Thomas Sankara came to power in 1983. Ironically, the revolt by the military to overthrow a neo-colonial government in the country then known as Upper Volta was led by Blaise Compaore and other officers. Sankara had been jailed by the regime, which feared him and his popularity. And who knows what might have happened to him. But as soon as the neo-colonial regime was overthrown, Blaise Compaore and other officers realized that Sankara was the natural leader. He was 33 years old at the time. In 1983, Compaore himself was 32 years old. So they were very young, these officers that set out to change the course of Burkina Faso's history and African history. So the first thing that they did was to change the name of the country from Upper Volta, that's the colonial name that the country had during French colonial rule and after paper independence. They changed the country to Burkina Faso. Obviously, it was significant for two reasons. Burkina Faso, land of the upright people, morally upright. Of course, the second thing was physically upright. They will no longer be bent, no longer stoop to neocolonialism. So that was the significance of that name change from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso. And they set to work very quickly. In the short period that Sankara and his compatriots were in power, from 1983 to 1987, they accomplished so much more than the entire post-colonial history of that country from 1960s up to the time they seized power in 1983. The first thing they did was to deliver government to the people. And what do I mean by that? They created committees to defend the revolution. That was the name, Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, throughout the country. And this was able to allow people to participate in determining their own destiny. In most African countries, the ruling elite have no connection at all with the masses of the population who live primarily in the rural countryside. The government in most African countries are operated by the petty bourgeoisie, whether in suits and ties, whether in military uniforms. They fail to mobilize the population. So politics, essentially, is largely the preserve of the ruling elite in much of Africa. And that is something that the late Walter Rodney used to critique on a regular basis. Rodney said, after independence, essentially, even though independence was historically very important for African countries and the Caribbean, however, what followed was basically the replacement of European colonial governors by African rulers, whether on the continent or in the Caribbean. But the structures of governance remained the same. Power concentrated within the ruling elite, who in turn were basically subcontractors on behalf of Western capital, dominated by the former colonial powers and dominated by the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, who dictate the terms of Africa's economics and Africa's politics as condition for the loans that they give to African countries. And Rodney had always questioned, how can power be decentralized? How can the masses be embraced? in one of his speeches, which is also on YouTube, Crisis in the Periphery, Africa and the Caribbean, a speech from the late 1970s. Rodney at one point actually said, perhaps we should be flexible. Maybe revolutionary transformative change can come from within the military, if not from the men in suits and ties, whom he condemns in that same speech, saying the petty bourgeoisie will never be able to lead anybody except to ruin in both Africa and the Caribbean. And he held out slight hope that perhaps this transformative change could come from the military after the revolution in Ethiopia that ended the monarchy. At that time, the emperor was Haile Selassie II. So this is the mid-70s now. But then that revolution, which initially had been led by young students and professionals in Ethiopia, was hijacked by the military after they deposed the emperor. The military became brutal, reactionary, and committed mass atrocities, massacres of students, workers, and the professional class. So by the time he made his speech, the military in Ethiopia had become reactionary. So Rodney kept wondering, where can transformative change come from? Of course, Rodney himself had already been assassinated in Guyana by the reactionary government of Burnham by the time Sankara came to power in 1983 in Burkina Faso. And Sankara actually fulfilled what Rodney had imagined, that perhaps transformation can come from within the military. So after taking power, taking government to the grassroots, through the committees for the defense of the revolution, people were mobilized, agricultural production after land reform soared, and within 3 years, Burkina Faso was food self-sufficient. Thomas Sankara had said, if any Burkinabe, as the people now were known, wanted any evidence to prove that they were a neo-colonial country, all they had to do was look at their plates and look at the imported food that they consume. He said any country that was unable to feed itself was a neo-colonial country. Now that the people have been mobilized, they were able to participate in much more constructive activities. They participated in building roads, in building a rail line, in building hospitals and clinics, in building schools throughout the country, in mobilizing teachers to go throughout the country for mass education to end illiteracy. They also took agency over their lives by building millions of trees in order to stop deforestation and desertification, which was eating up the arable land in the country. Sankara also introduced laws that protected women. So forced marriages were ended, they were banned, genital cutting, banned, and he also empowered women by appointing them to meaningful jobs, not token jobs, in his government. Women were also recruited into the armed forces and trained how to use weapons. He also wanted to affect the men's mindset to really put pressure against the culture of patriarchy So on Women's Day, International Women's Day, the men for turn would actually go food shopping and prepare the meals for their wives, for the women. And that itself was a tremendous learning experience. Many of the men wondered how, with the meager financial resources, the women had been able to feed them for such a long time. So it might look like something small or minor, but it had tremendous impact in changing the mindset and attitude of the men toward women. He also wanted to end the elitism of the ruling petty bourgeoisie class. So he reduced the salaries of public officials, including his own. He banned the use of luxury vehicles such as Mercedes Benz. He said the country simply could not afford that kind of expenditure, and encouraged the use of small cars, including even carpooling by senior officials. He did not want any ostentatious display in a country where everybody else was struggling. He also encouraged the promotion of domestic production. His mantra was, let us consume what we produce and let us produce what we consume. Not only for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa. So he encouraged the wearing of domestic produced clothing. He himself set the example by wearing only Burkinabe produced clothes. And this in itself created a multi-million-dollar industry by boosting production of cotton, boosting production of textiles. People were employed in tailoring, created tens of thousands of jobs, particularly for women. Now, Thomas Sankara came to the United States in 1984 to address the General Assembly of the United Nations. He was tempted by the U.S. with a potential visit to the White House with Ronald Reagan. But as a condition for the visit, U.S. diplomats insisted on reading the speech that he intended to deliver to the United Nations in advance. And of course, he rejected that. So he was denied the White House visit. Thomas Sankara went to Harlem, and he said, Harlem is my White House. So he addressed supporters in Harlem. Very similar, reminiscent of what Fidel Castro did in 1960, when he had some issues with a downtown hotel and ended up going to Harlem, where he stayed at the Hotel Teresa and met many prominent African American leaders at the time, including Malcolm X. So while in Harlem, Sankara spoke fondly of his 1983 meeting with Maurice Bishop, the revolutionary prime minister of Grenada. Of course, by that time, Maurice Bishop had been assassinated in October 1983 by reactionary elements within his government. And Sankara said, in order to prevent such assassinations, those engaged in resisting imperialism globally had to rededicate their efforts, improve their organizing, and improve their sharing of information between those resisting imperialism in Africa and those in diaspora. Thomas Sankara ultimately touched the third rail of global imperialism at the Organization of African Unity meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in July 1987. Sankara was very critical of other African leaders at that conference for enriching themselves while their population suffered under the burden of the debt repayment and debt servicing conditions set by the World Bank and IMF. Sankara said the only way that Africa could develop was to eliminate this debt burden. And he urged the other leaders to have a collective voice in confronting the West over the debt issue. Sankara said, "If Burkina Faso goes it alone, I will not be alive to attend next year's Organization of African Unity meeting, OAU, which is the predecessor organization to the African Union, AU, which was established 20 years ago. The OAU itself was founded in 1963, also in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia." There's a very interesting video on YouTube. Anybody can search it. Thomas Sankara speaking at OAU conference in 1987. Speaking in French, but there are captions and translations. And you see the African leaders in the audience nodding, agreeing with what he was saying. But in reality, they did not support him. They did not, for example, issue a communique at the conference supporting his proposal. Sankara's predictions were correct. Not only did he not live until the following year, 3 months later, on October 15, 1987, brutally assassinated by a person who was supposed to be his compatriot, together with other accomplices. Blaise Compaore, who was a darling of France, a darling of the Ivory Coast, who had been led by Houphouët-Boigny, who was seen as a puppet of France. And Compaore was also married to an Ivorian woman, supposedly at the suggestion of Houphouët-Boigny himself, in order to keep tab on Thomas Sankara and his activities. This is very similar to what happened in the Congo when Patrice Lumumba was betrayed by somebody whom he had also promoted in the military, Joseph Désiré Mobutu, later known as Mobutu Sese Seko, who, unknown to Lumumba, had been on the payroll of the CIA as early as 1958, 2 years before Congo's independence. So in Congo in 1960, Mobutu was used to overthrow Lumumba. Only 3 months after independence in June 1960, and then brutally murdered in January 1961. Similarly, in Burkina Faso, Blaise Compaore betrayed Thomas Sankara. And there's also similarity in something else in both cases. In Congo, some of Lumumba's closest associates, including Maurice Mpolo, who was also assassinated together with Lumumba by firing squad, had actually urged Lumumba to remove Mobutu from command of the military. Did not trust Mobutu. Unfortunately, that did not happen. Nevertheless, imperialism would have used somebody else had it not been Mobutu. to eliminate Lumumba. In Burkina Faso, some of Sankara's closest associates also urged him to have Compaore arrested when it became clear that he was actually plotting to remove Sankara. And Sankara famously said that he would not be the first to betray his comrade. The rest is now history. Burkina Faso, of course, is facing many challenges, including from violent militants invading from the north, using weapons that became abundant in the Sahel and Western North Africa after the destruction of the Libyan government under Gaddafi during the NATO war more than a decade ago. Those weapons are still causing havoc throughout North and Western Africa. And Burkina Faso is paying the price of that as well. Hundreds of thousands of people displaced from their homes as a result of the violence led to a weak political structure and led to the military coup in January 2022, which removed the civilian government that was in place shortly after the removal of Blaise Compaore. But perhaps there is some promising sign in the sense that the new military administration, number one, allowed the trial to proceed, which ended in the conviction in absentia of Compaore. Number two, which is also important, the same military authority also echoed the memory and legacy of Thomas Sankara when they came to power. Is there a possibility that they might turn out to be progressive? Only time will tell. In the meantime, I encourage anybody who is interested in supporting the change.org campaign to please go to change.org and look for that petition. And the petition simply says, Ivory Coast extradite Blaise Compaore to Burkina Faso to face justice. Our luta continua. Long live the memory and the legacy of Thomas Sankara and all other Pan-African revolutionaries who fell in the struggle for the complete independence of Africa from neo-colonialism. Thank you. See you all soon. Remain Pan-African.